Now they're starting to think, what's going to happen with the 26 harvest, 26, 27 harvest in Brazil?
Right.
And that's the uncertainty that is now playing into the market. That's why we still see the market around the 370s, 380s, because there's been relatively low rainfall in Brazil. We still haven't reached the period
Early
where
flowering.
it becomes critical. There's been some early flowering. The big flowering should occur in the next few weeks. And if that doesn't happen, then of course we might see the market skyrocket again, right? But we still don't know what's going to happen. And there's plenty of different views in terms of what the weather in Brazil is going to be in the next month in October, which is the critical period for the rain. And then we need to see more rain, right? Not just one rain that you need to see at least rain into March, constant rain into March. So that's why I think with what's happening, low certified stocks, lots of different trade wars coming on, and in general, low availability of stocks everywhere. There's very little extra coffee around. That's why I think that for the next 6 to 9 months, we'll continue to see high prices because there's too much uncertainty and very little buffer in the market to think that we'll see a significant drop in the seed price in the next 6 to 9 months.
If you're starting or growing your business in these volatile times in coffee and you need a little extra support, our scope of business advisory services may be just what you need. Send us an email to discuss our one-on-one consulting and business advisory services, where we'll work with you one-on-one to solve specific problems in your coffee business. All our services come with a 100% money-back guarantee, so send us an email at support@mapperforward.org and let us know how we can help you today. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 2 of a 5-part series where we're talking about how is 2025 playing out for coffee. We have our very first guest of the podcast for this year, Alejandro from Caravela. We are revisiting a lot of the stuff that we talked about in that very first series of this year so that we can kind of look at how 2025 has played out based on some of the things that we talked about. One of the things that was a real theme in that conversation, Alejandro, was the volatility that we were looking at facing in the year ahead. And there were we had an idea of what the forces were going to be that would define what that volatility would be. And I guess in this conversation, we're going to talk about has that played out? But let's start that by revisiting what have been some of the main forces that have really stoked the volatility of 2025 in your mind.
Well, the first one is, of course, weather in Brazil. That's the major force that, every time the sea market goes up, it's always Brazil, and it's always the weather, right? Even in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and now the same thing. It's either it's too dry or it's too cold, right? We saw the dryness play out in early, late last year, and how that started affecting, what would have been a really good harvest, and then during the harvest, we started to see some of the effects of that. Nobody, despite some of the trade houses and people said that it, ended up, it was going to be okay, right? And that kind of drove the market down in June, July, right? It was okay. There was very little damage. The bean size was great. There's less defects. All those things. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the harvest, they come back and say, "Hey, we were wrong." Right, so there was an effect. We don't work in Brazil, so I don't get to see that. We do have a couple of good friends in Brazil that were saying, "Hey, it's brutal. This was really bad. Yeah. It was even worse than last year." So we were kind of hearing that, but of course, it's just one or two. You don't know if that's the case for everybody. I was a bit worried by hearing that because they're good friends, and I know they wouldn't lie to me. But then the market kind of said, "Oh, it's going to be fine." And that's why we saw the market drop down from the 4s to the 270s. And then at the very end of the harvest, everything completely changes. And now we're having issues with quality. And then at the tail end, we also saw a little bit of frost. Not huge, but there was some frost. But anything that is negative.
Still sneezes.
Yeah, but with the tightness in the market, any little bad news drives
Certified
volatility.
stocks, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah.
And then you couple that with the certified stocks, and you add UDI, and you add all the geopolitics, and you add the Trump tariffs, and it becomes a knock-on effect on volatility. And of course, volatility drives financial players into the market. We've seen the last few trading, the August trading days where the volumes traded were massive, which means that financial players were saying, "Hey, let's go there," right? And especially when you see there's also a financial effect that people sometimes forget about, especially more people in the coffee industry. That when people start saying the Fed is going to decrease the interest rate, well, guess what? That also plays into the financial players because they're looking for sources of good returns. And as the Fed rate goes down, their money becomes cheaper, but also their appetite for risk increases. And so there's plenty of forces that play into the market. Now, whether the financial players play a long-term effect into the market, that's in doubt. In the end, markets are, especially future markets, are forward-looking. They always look months ahead. And so what the market is actually looking at the moment is not what's happening today or what happened in the Brazilian harvest. Now they're starting to think what's going to happen with the 26 harvest, 26-27 harvest in Brazil.
Right.
And that's the uncertainty that is now playing into the market. And that's why we still see the market around the 370s, 380s, because there's been relatively low rainfall in Brazil. We still haven't reached the period
Early
where
flowering.
It becomes critical. There's been some early flowering. The big flowering should occur in the next few weeks. And if that doesn't happen, then of course we might see the market skyrocket again, right? But we still don't know what's going to happen. And there's plenty of different views in terms of what the weather in Brazil is going to be in the next month in October, which is the critical period for the rain. And then we need to see more rain, right? Not just one rain that you need to see at least rain into March, constant rain into March. So that's why I think with what's happening, low certified stocks, lots of different trade wars coming on, and in general, low availability of stocks everywhere. There's very little extra coffee around. That's why I think that for the next 6 to 9 months, we'll continue to see high prices because there's too much uncertainty and very little buffer in the market to think that we'll see a significant drop in the C price in the next 6 to 9 months.
Do you think that coffee in general as an industry, and this is where we can start talking about businesses like Luckin, do you think that one of the forces at play in the market this year is that you have these huge, well-capitalized, big businesses coming in and saying, we're going to build empires in coffee. And this is, in my opinion, this is something this is 3D chess, right? This is reshaping the board game. Do you see the same thing happening? Do you agree that that's a major force in 2025?
I guess that's one of the forces, but I think there's many forces. I mean, you look at the U.S. Let's center more. I'm not too much familiar with the Chinese market, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. But I think I'm fortunate. Sorry. But anyway, look at the U.S. Look at the growth of those coffee shop chains that are focusing exclusively in drive-through. They're growing like crazy.
Same in Europe as well. That's a huge thing that's happening in Europe at the moment as well, from what we hear.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, yes, Luckin and the Chinese success story with coffee and the fact that they're growing and growing and they're drinking more and more coffee, and they still have a lot more room to grow. But I think in general, I don't see coffee declining. I see coffee growing. And we still see the demand rising. And yes, there are forces like matcha, which I think it's tiny bit of the market. yeah, there's a lot of hype around it, but it's still very tiny, and probably will continue to be very tiny because there's not a lot of matchup for everybody out there. But I think in general, I would say that the coffee market continues to grow, and we have a few customers, really good customers, that were targeting 0% growth this year, and have told us that they're growing 20-30% this year.
Wow.
Yes.
Where do you think, is that because their competitors have gone out of business? Is that because things just unexpectedly landed well? Is that because, what do you think is driving that?
I think it's brands that are well positioned and that have been able to get business from companies that are failing, that are not doing that well. Either have exited their markets or have shrink their presence in those markets, and they've been able to they're well positioned to take the place of those less weaker opponents, right? It's always a chess game, right? There's very a lot of things it's always people think that it's easy, but no, real business is actually a very strategic game. And so I think those companies were well positioned strategically, were had everything in place so that when things like this happen, they could fill those voids very easily, right? So in general, and this is companies that don't buy cheap coffee. These are companies that buy very good quality coffee and have been paying very good prices. So that also tells you that there's always opportunities at all sorts of levels, right? There are opportunities at the lock-in levels, but there are also opportunities at the high-end levels. As long as you've strategically positioned yourself well in the market that you cater to, and I think one thing that I think we're seeing a lot, at least at the Caravela, is that companies that have not played the big game, let's conquer the world game, but let's position ourselves in very niche markets where we can serve those markets in a very good fashion, right? Because that is also placed into the strategic sense. If I'm strategic, I make choices. I don't go everywhere. I don't push everywhere. I choose where I want to play. And those are the companies that are really winning because they've made those strategic choices. Say, I want to focus, not do everything, not try to get to everywhere.
A force that is instrumental in that strategy that you just mentioned is the consumer. And I feel like in a year like 2025, the consumer has been an unpredictable force, mostly because of the uncertainty that they're facing, not just from the rising coffee prices, but from a lot of things. What are your thoughts around the role of the consumer in the volatility as a force of volatility in coffee?
Well, I think consumers, of course, that they're the final end. If the consumer is not satisfied with what they have, they will always find choices, right? There's always, and in coffee, there's more and more choices. So yes, I think consumer plays a big role, and in the sense that, if you listen to what they want, then you will probably be very successful, right? And this is my personal opinion. I don't think consumers in coffee consumers are looking for a lot of things. I think coffee consumers are very focused on what they want. They know what they want, and as long as they get it consistently, they will always return to you, right? That goes a little bit in opposite with a lot of with what we see in the new wave of coffee, that they want to have 50 different coffees, one different coffee a week, and they want to have all the different types of processes and anaerobics and coffee ferment. So I think as long as you are catering to the needs of the coffee consumer, which is very simple. I think coffee is a comfort item in your daily rituals, right? Coffee that's why it's the breakfast beverage, right? That's why it's the first thing you think, because it provides comfort, right? And so I guess the answer to your question is that consumer, as long as you understand the consumer and you're willing to listen to what your consumers want, it's going to be easy to be successful in coffee.
One of the things that I have been trying to understand this year is what is going to happen with regards to the supply of coffee related to the consuming habits of the consumer. And what I am predicting, what I think is going to eventuate, is that given what's happening with prices, given what's happening with the reaction that businesses, more on the smaller end of the business spectrum, are experiencing, is that I think that we are going to see a gutting out of the middle with regards to quality and with regards to pricing. I think that what we're going to start to see is that consumers are going to be, or the business models that are either targeted towards the high-end specialty coffee market, or the businesses that are targeted towards the commercial, conventional side of things. That's going to be the two extremes of the business model. And the center is a business model that's not really going to be proved to be viable. Do you have any opinions about that? Do you think that that's a strategy that is going to play out differently than what I'm expecting?
I don't disagree with you on that one, Nate. I think the phenomenon that you mentioned of crowding out of the middle market,
yep,
had already occurred.
Oh,
we certainly saw it. We've seen it for the last 7, 8 years, where the middle was crowded out by these top end lots or cheaper, more high commercial coffee. So companies kind of decided, we don't longer need to buy 85-point coffee. We can buy high commercial 80, 81-point coffee. That's good enough for our blends, for our espresso. And I'll focus on buying high commercial and really top end lots. That is a phenomenon that had already occurred. Mm-hmm. So what I'm predicting, and I might be wrong, this is just my personal opinion, is that we'll see companies going to the middle, because that market has been crowded out already. So there are now opportunities in the middle market that did not exist a year or two ago. And so if you can't compete with the big guys on the high commercial, that's a lost proposition. That is a market where the big guys will always be better positioned to compete. That's a high volume, low price model. No specialty roaster can afford to compete with the big guys in that market. Yeah, the big guys have already
cornered it, owned it.
That market, right? And they have better marketing budgets, more scale than any specialty roaster. Mm-hmm. And then the high-end market is now not so great, because let's put it, there's not that much of high-end coffee, right?
Right.
So I think there's now an opportunity, and if I had a coffee roaster, I think I would my strategy would be, let's focus on the middle market. That's where nobody now lies. That's where.
But is there the supply? And there, because the conversations that I'm having with producers is that they're saying it is so stressful to do business with the middle of the market that it is easier for us, given that the prices are where they are, to just send it to the commercial market. We also can't get access to labor. And so with all of this stress that's around that, it's easier to just, in a year like 2025, send our coffee to the commercial market. What am I not understanding there?
You're right in the sense that it's become a lot harder for coffee farmers to do what they need to do to produce an 85, 86-point coffee. Yeah. Especially labor is the biggest threat. And so you talk to, I think, most farmers, even in Brazil, you talk to farmers, nobody wants to grow.
Right.
Because growth means more labor needed.
Investment.
And that's the last. You can invest, you can plant as much trees as you'd like. The problem is not, planting those trees. The problem is harvesting those trees when the harvest comes in. If you can't, harvest 4 hectares, forget about 8 hectares or 6 hectares, right? So
right.
You'd better stay where you are and not grow your planted area. So that's the first thing we're hearing. Now, we still have enough capacity to supply more of the 84, 85-point coffee. I have no doubt that we can find 84, 85-point coffee, double the size of what we at Caravela offer as 84, 85-point coffee.
Okay.
My thinking, and I might get, pounded by farmers, is that producing an 84 point coffee is not very difficult. And it's not ridiculously expensive, more expensive than producing an 82 point coffee. Right? I've always thought that nobody has been able to prove me that I'm wrong. I'm happy for somebody to prove that I am wrong. Producing an 87, 88 point coffee is a different story, right?
Right.
But producing an 84, 85 point coffee is best practices. Just do best practices. Just have a very clear, procedures and repeat those procedures every time that you do things. That's why it's not very expensive, because it's just process. It's just perfecting your processes. So it doesn't cost you more than producing an 81. I actually argue that it might even cost you less, because when you produce an 81, 82 point coffee, there's a lot of inefficiencies. So you pick a lot on the ripes. Your yields become lower, so your costs end up being higher because you have a lot more, defects and issues. So in the end, I think 84, 85 is the sweet spot. And from my experience talking to farmers, that is also the sweet spot for them. And it's a sweet spot because, yes, you get a premium versus the 81, 82 point coffee, which is significant enough, but it doesn't cost you that much. So it's an easy way to improve your profitability, right? Mm-hmm. Then the 87s, that's a different story. The volumes and scale don't give you a lot of extra profit, right? So I disagree that the fact that there's not enough 84, 85 point coffee. As long as you're willing to pay for it, there will be plenty of supply for that, right? And so the question is there the willingness to pay for it?
To pay, right. Which sets us up perfectly for the next conversation, because in the next episode, we're talking about the impact of pricing and funding in the supply chain for 2025, because I think that you're going to the heart of the problem here. Given that the prices are so high, people are no longer able to or willing to pay the prices that they're being asked for what they were previously being asked for an 84 point coffee in 2025. So join us in the next episode, folks, and we're going to talk money. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. This episode is part of a 5-part series produced by Mapper Forward. Check the full playlist and guest details in the show notes, as well as how you can support our work in the coffee industry. Become a premium YouTube subscriber, explore our Patreon and any brands we've partnered with to bring you this podcast. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really does help us grow our audience.